You're at dinner, and everything around you gleams, the plates are silver, the goblets are gold, and even the forks, yes, forks, which most Western Europeans still consider suspiciously decadent, are polished to a smug shine. You, of course, are not just eating. You're conducting a culinary symphony. Every dish, every hand gesture, every sip of wine must be perfectly timed, because this isn't a meal. It's a lesson in manners, grace, and imperial superiority. This is where things get weirdly charming. Because tonight, your guests are being treated not only to roast peacock, honey-drenched pastries, and musicians playing the aulas, a reed instrument that sounds like a snake charmer doing jazz, but also a little something you wrote yourself, yes, your famous book of table manners. Who else but you, emperor, scholar, ceremonial director, secret introvert, would write a how-to guide on dinner etiquette for young nobles? Who else would spend hours detailing the correct way to sit, fold a napkin, and not gross out your host with barbarian chewing? It's called the Treatise on Imperial Banquets, and no, that's not a joke. You literally created a behavioral manual because you were tired of watching aristocrats lick their fingers or burp mid-sentence like provincial goat herders, and in your world. Etiquette is everything that you've been to enough banquets where a cousin of a senator slurped his wine like he was draining a trench. You've seen people grab bread with both hands, or, heaven forbid, use the wrong knife for the lamb course. So naturally, you did the only logical thing, you made decorum imperial law. You wrote things like, do not lean back in your chair like a centaur after battle, and, do not pick your teeth with your fingernails. Sound advice, really, and sure, it seems funny now, but this treatise wasn't just a collection of pet peeves. It was a cultural mission, because the truth is, you were fighting a war, and not the kind with swords and screaming. This was a battle against sloppiness. Against the slow cultural decay that creeps into every society when people stop caring about the little things. You knew that empires don't collapse because of one big failure. They unravel in 1,000 small ways. A little corruption here. A little neglect there. Someone slurping soup like a barbarian, and before you know it, boom. Rome falls. Again. So you turned dinner into discipline, and in doing so, you revealed something deeper about yourself. Something maybe your generals and scholars suspected but rarely said aloud. You were a control freak, but not the bad kind, the kind who understands that civilization, especially one as ancient and precarious as Byzantium, survives only through deliberate performance. Every gesture at your banquets, from how a goblet is passed to when the harpist begins to play, is part of the script. Even laughter is timed. You're not just trying to make sure people eat politely, you're teaching them to exist politely. Historians still argue whether your obsession with decorum was driven by anxiety, piety, or just plain fastidiousness. But most agree, Constantine VII saw etiquette as a kind of moral armor. A way to shield Byzantium from the barbarism knocking at every gate, and it wasn't just about the nobles. You knew the middle class, merchants, craftsmen, scribes, were watching. Mimicking. Emulating. You weren't just shaping aristocratic behavior, you were building a social language that said, this is how a Roman behaves. You wanted everyone to understand that refinement wasn't a luxury, it was a civic duty. It's why you insisted on harmony in court music, on balance in architecture, and on clarity in imperial decrees. Even your clothing guidelines reflected this obsession. You once banned certain colors at court events because they clashed with the marble tiles. Fashion crimes were practically treason. Quirky sidebar, one guest wore a fur hat to a summer feast and nearly caused a scandal. Why? Because it wasn't seasonally appropriate and made him look like a provincial tax collector. You didn't scold him, but you did spend the next week rewriting a portion of your etiquette treatise to include hats unbecoming of the season. The lesson was heard, but etiquette, for you, wasn't only about preventing awkward dinners. It was part of a larger vision. You believed that aesthetics were tied to ethics. That symmetry in a banquet mirrored justice in the empire. That how people held their forks said something about how they'd rule a province, or betray a friend. So you made every event at court, from weddings to religious feasts to boring budget meetings, reflect the same polished, ritualized order. Even your approach to food followed a cosmic rhythm. Meals weren't thrown together. They followed liturgical calendars. Fasting days were strictly observed. Certain fish could only be served during particular seasons. And wine was watered precisely to show restraint. Drunkenness? A sign of spiritual decay. One of your proudest inventions was the silent course at imperial banquets. During this stage, no one could speak. Not a word. Everyone just sat, ate quietly, and listened to music or watched dancers perform stories from scripture. It sounds a bit extra, but in those quiet moments, the empire seemed to breathe as one. In you? You sat at the head of the table, watching, listening, writing notes for the next edition of your treatise. Always adjusting, always improving, because for you, the empire wasn't static. It was a living manuscript, and every person, every meal, every gesture was a sentence. You were the editor-in-chief, and dinner was just another chapter in your long, obsessive, glorious book. You don't trust many people, but you've made your peace with that. It's not paranoia, it's realism. After all, your uncles tried to kill you, your father died under suspicious circumstances, and half the court still thinks you're more parchment than person. So when it comes to writing your magnum opuses, you take no chances. You retreat to your favorite room in the palace, a quiet chamber just off the main library, lined with scrolls and icons, smelling faintly of wax and dried rose petals. It's your sanctuary. No courtiers, no ceremony. Just you, a scribal assistant or two, and about 100 half-finished chapters of imperial brilliance. Tonight, you're revising the Administrando Imperio, your other great work, the one that's half political science textbook, half survival guide for future emperors. You've written it for your son, Romanos too, though you doubt he'll ever really appreciate it. He's a bit more enthusiastic about falconry than governance. Still, you press on, because this book. It's everything. It's a how-to manual for holding together an empire that stretches from the Adriatic to Armenia. You explain how to negotiate with the Pecheneg, why the Croats are always slightly unpredictable, and what tricks to use when dealing with arrogant Frankish envoys who think wine means drink until unconscious. You don't just give facts, you give tactics. For example, if a barbarian king insists on marrying a Byzantine princess, stall him with flattery, offer meaningless titles, and distract him with gifts until he either dies or forgets he asked. It's part diplomacy, part stand-up comedy. Quirky tidbit. There's a whole section where you describe the various languages and dialects spoken by your empire's neighbors, and you don't hold back. Some you praise as elegant. Others? You compare to the croaking of frogs in a stone jar. Yikes, but it's not meant to be mean. Well, maybe a little. It's honesty. You know these people. You've watched them in court, listened to their traders haggle in the markets, observed their warriors at border skirmishes. You write from the eye of the storm, and you want your son to see what you've seen. Historians still argue whether the Administrando Imperio was really intended for Romanos, or if, deep down, you knew it was a legacy piece. Something that would outlive you, pass from scribe to scribe until some curious monk centuries later would rediscover it and marvel, this emperor knew everything. But while your tone is scholarly, your message is deeply personal. You're teaching your son how to read between the lines of empire, because you've realized something, maybe the most important thing of all: the empire is not a machine. It's not held together by walls or armies or coins. It's held together by people, and people are messy. They lie, they gossip, they rebel, they sulk. They praise you to your face and plot your downfall at dinner. They forget the treaty they signed last week and declare war over a goat 2 days later. So your book teaches not just the names of foreign kings, but the habits of their tribes. Not just maps of trade routes, but where to send spies and which merchants can be bribed for information. You even explain weather patterns. Why? Because you know that launching a campaign in the Balkans during mud season is the fastest way to get your boots, and your empire, stuck. And here's the wild part: you don't write it like a royal decree, you write like a dad. You literally address your son as, "My dear child." You pause between chapters to offer advice: don't be quick to anger. Don't trust men who speak too smoothly. Always read the fine print on treaties. Okay, maybe that last one's a paraphrase, but the vibe is there. This book is your heart, veiled in strategy, cloaked in geopolitics, but pulsing with love and fear and all the things you'll never say out loud. because being emperor? It's lonely, you don't have friends. You have allies, informants, scribes, and maybe the occasional eunuch who can be trusted not to sell you out. Your wife, bless her, does her best. But this isn't a rom-com, she has her own networks to manage. So you write, you pour yourself into these pages, page after page of warnings, insights, tricks, and truths. You write not just what to do, but what not to do, like, don't rely too heavily on the Varangian Guard. Sure, they're loyal now, but give them enough gold and they'll start eyeing the treasury like it's a sweet roll. Or, don't underestimate the Slavs. They might seem disorganized, but their chiefs are watching, learning, and waiting for Byzantium to blink. You sprinkle in historical flashbacks, mini lessons on earlier emperors who blew it. Like that time one of your predecessors ignored Armenian tribal politics and got half his army stuck in a ravine. You write it casually, but your point is razor sharp, pay attention, or you'll end up a footnote. And you're not afraid to brag a little, you slip in a line or two about how you handled a rebellious general with nothing but a clever forged letter and a well-timed gift of silk. You never name yourself, but anyone reading knows, yeah, that was Constantine being smooth, but here's the kicker, you write as if someone will read this and need it. Not just Romanos. Maybe a grandson. Maybe a monk in the year 1300. Maybe a stranger, maybe you're writing for history itself. It's a weird kind of hope. Quiet. Unspoken. But it's there, humming between every line, that someone, anyone, will look back and say, he tried. He taught. He cared. Because in the end, you know that empires die. Even Byzantium, but ideas get copied. Ideas survive, and if your empire must one day crumble, at least it will fall with footnotes. So, here's a fun thing about being emperor, you get all the blame and all the credit, often for things you didn't exactly do. If a treaty holds, you're a genius. If a horse slips on a rainy road and a bishop breaks his leg, you're somehow also responsible for that. Which is why, as you walk through the marble halls today, flanked by flickering oil lamps and perfumed guards, you're thinking not about policies or poetry, but about image, because in Byzantium, image is everything. You learned that early, when you were a boy and the court was whispering that you looked too much like your mother. She was from a noble family, sure, but people had opinions. Maybe you were too quiet. Too clever. Not warrior-like enough. So you adapted, you didn't start wearing armor and riding into battle like a teenage action figure. You started crafting yourself. Carefully. Relentlessly. Like a mosaic, every appearance at court was rehearsed. Every robe stitched with meaning. Your face. Shaved smooth, no beards allowed in your proximity unless they belonged to religious elders. Why? Because you understood something most emperors ignored, you were both a ruler and a symbol, which brings us to your favorite pastime, manipulating imperial iconography like a Renaissance Instagram manager. You designed coins. Not just the boring kind with a crown and some standard motto, but coins with layers of messaging. On one set, you appear holding a miniature church, symbolizing your devotion. On another, you're seated beside Christ himself, not as an equal, obviously, that would be blasphemous, but clearly his chosen buddy. It's humble bragging in gold, and let's talk portraits. Your official likeness always has the same vibe, serene, wise, modest, but powerful. A kind of, don't mess with me, I'm one fasting vigil away from calling angels, aesthetic. You even tweak your facial features just slightly in official images, bigger eyes, smaller mouth. Not because you're vain. Because you know that art teaches. And you want future generations to see an emperor who looks less like a tyrant, more like a philosopher saint. Historians still argue whether this was personal insecurity or strategic branding genius. Either way, it worked. Foreign envoys came expecting a dusty, bookish recluse and left bowing, dazzled by an emperor who walked like a sage and talked like a diplomat who'd read every treaty ever written, twice, but you didn't stop with visuals. Oh no, you curated your own mythology. You encouraged monks and court writers to record visions and dreams that showed you being chosen by God. You made sure your charitable donations, hospitals, orphanages, religious endowments, were highly visible. And you had songs written. Yes, literal songs, played at imperial ceremonies, praising your wisdom, your justice, your skin that supposedly glowed like beeswax in morning light. Flattering? A little much? Maybe. But again, this wasn't ego.it was armor, because image wasn't just about impressing the peasants or foreign visitors. It was a defensive strategy. There were always plots, always, every month, some distant cousin or scheming general tried to raise an army or buy off a bishop. You survived not by crushing rebellions with brute force, though you did have to do that once or twice, but by preempting them. You made yourself too sacred to challenge. Too anointed to oppose, and when that failed, you used pageantry like chloroform. During religious holidays, you staged processions so grand that the city forgot its problems. You paraded relics, bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, through the streets, while incense clouded the air and choirs sang chants that wrapped around the marble arches like music from another world. You once processed for 6 hours straight just to counter a rumor that you were sick. Did it work? Let's just say, by hour 4, people were crying from sheer emotional exhaustion. Quirky note, you insisted on controlling the color schemes for these events. You once delayed a procession by a full day because the banners were stitched in a red that clashed with the icon of Saint Michael. Priorities, and speaking of icons, yes, you got involved with those, too. At a time when the church was still nervously recovering from the whole iconoclasm debacle, you became one of the staunch defenders of sacred images. Not just because you believed in them spiritually, you did, but because you saw their utility. Icons were more than devotional tools. They were political weapons. You made sure your likeness appeared beside Christ in mosaic form, not just in coins, but in actual church walls. You weren't claiming divinity, of course. That would be awkward. But you were certainly suggesting proximity. Affiliation. A kind of spiritual VIP status. Some people rolled their eyes. Others whispered that you were getting too theatrical. But you knew the truth. Perception was policy. You wanted the people to see a ruler who read scripture, wrote books, honored the saints, and personally oversaw orphanages. Even if some of that was ghostwritten or delegated, you made sure the message was clear. Constantine VII is a living embodiment of Byzantine virtue. And honestly, it was kind of beautiful, because the empire needed hope. Taxes were high. Plagues came and went. The borders were constantly stressed by tribal raids and naval threats. People needed something to believe in. Someone to look up to. So you offered them not just an emperor, but an idea. You were Constantine Porphyrogenitos, the purple-born, chosen by God, guardian of civilization, poet of policy, and, yes, the guy who once paused a state meeting to correct the grammar on a religious inscription. And despite everything, despite the betrayals, the anxiety, the heavy silence of the throne room after midnight, you held the line. You were a mirror in gold leaf. A mosaic of power and precision, and every polished surface reflected the message: the empire endures. It's early morning, and the city is half asleep, its rooftops silvered by the first hints of dawn. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, bakers are stoking fires and monks are beginning their prayers. But here in your private quarters, it's still, cool, and quiet, except for the faint rustle of parchment as you sift through a fresh stack of letters from the provinces. And somewhere beneath your smooth imperial exterior, you're deeply, quietly worried, because the empire never stops shifting. That it's like trying to juggle flaming torches on a ship in a storm, while reading a book and composing poetry. Just yesterday, news came from the Armenian frontier. Tense. Too quiet. And you know that kind of silence is rarely peaceful. Meanwhile, down in southern Italy, some clever Lombard count has been cozying up to the Pope again. Of course he is. It never ends. You lean back, stare at the ceiling, and think, this whole thing, it's so delicate, and then you catch yourself smiling, because somehow, despite it all, it's still standing, and that's not an accident. That it's because of what you built, what you are building. Quietly, obsessively, patiently, one policy, one phrase, one ritual at a time. See, everyone talks about the great generals. The warriors who win battles and carve out territory. And yes, those guys get statues. They get ballads. They get dramatic death scenes with blood on marble and tearful farewells, but you? You're the opposite kind of hero. You're the preventer. You're the one who stops wars before they start. Who keeps factions so busy squabbling over court etiquette that they forget to stage coups. Who writes treatises so convincing that the people you were supposed to conquer instead ask to be baptized and join the fold. Historians still argue whether your long, paperwork-heavy reign was a triumph or just a holding pattern. But they miss the point. Because what you've done, what you are doing, is subtler. It's not expansion. It's maintenance, and that's where the real art lies. Take, for example, your treaties. You don't just sign them, you orchestrate them. One recent agreement with the Rus. You had their envoys publicly swear on relics, then staged a religious procession in their honor. They left feeling honored and terrified. That's the goal. Then there's the economy. Dry stuff, right? Except when you spot a tax loophole being exploited by merchant guilds in Thessalonica and rework the entire fiscal code with surgical precision. You actually enjoyed that. It was like solving a math puzzle, except the stakes were, national survival. You've become a master of balance, between faith and politics. Between tradition and innovation. Between ruling with dignity and ruling with a side eye so sharp it could slice through marble. Quirky tidbit. You once ordered a rare Persian carpet to be cut and sewn into the lining of your winter cloak, not for style, but because the intricate pattern reminded you of the logical symmetry you love in imperial policy. Yes, you're that guy, but here's the thing you rarely admit, even to yourself: you're tired, not physically, though the hours have taken their toll, but spiritually. There's a kind of fatigue that comes from knowing every decision matters, that one misstep could unravel decades of work. You dream sometimes, wild, drifting dreams of a simple house in the countryside, figs ripening in a clay bowl, the sound of goats in the distance, no advisors in sight, but you wake up and remember, you chose this. Or maybe it chose you, you were born in the purple. After all. There's no quitting that. Still, on quiet nights, after the lamps are blown out and the corridors empty, you wonder what the empire will look like in 100 years. Or 1,000. Will it still stand? Will anyone remember the book you wrote about manners, or the time you reorganized the trade routes through the Aegean? Will they know that you were the one who told future emperors not to launch spring campaigns in Thrace because the rivers always flood? Will they remember your jokes, your real voice, or will you fade into one of those gold-tinged icons, silent and perfect, a name more than a person? You once told Romanos, the empire isn't a statue. It's a garden. You meant it. It needs tending. Weeding. Patience. Knowing when to prune and when to let something grow wild, and you've done that, haven't you? You've kept it alive. You've written the manual, trimmed the edges, tucked in the roots. Now all you can do is hope that someone, somewhere, will pick up the trowel and keep digging. But even as you reflect, even as you start to believe you've done all you can, another letter arrives. This one is sealed with wax bearing the insignia of your old friend Phocas, General of the East. He's asking for clarification on a border clause you wrote 5 years ago. Apparently, some tribal chief is claiming it gives him grazing rights over land he definitely doesn't own, and just like that, you're back in it. You light a fresh lamp, dip your pen, and start composing a response, calm, authoritative, layered with logic and subtle threat, because that's what you do. You smooth the chaos, you build systems where others would build walls, you write books instead of swinging swords, and somehow, it's worked. You haven't just ruled. You've lasted. In Byzantium. That's everything. There's something funny about endings, they rarely announce themselves. No ominous thunder. No trumpet blast. Just another morning. A courier knocking. A bowl of pomegranate seeds on your breakfast tray. Life continues, until it doesn't. You don't know it yet, but this stretch of days will be among your last. Not because you're wounded or coughing blood into a silk handkerchief. Just because time, like history, slips quietly away. But before we go there, let's look around one last time. Today, the palace hums with the usual blend of reverence and tension. Eunuchs shuffle by in velvet slippers, whispering about grain prices. Choir boys are rehearsing for tonight's vespers in the echoing hall beneath the dome. Outside, pigeons will over the Auguste Ion, and the Hagia Sophia casts its long shadow across the square, and in the middle of it all, you've aged, yes. The lines around your eyes are no longer philosophical. They're just lines. Your voice has lost some of its weight, and your once impeccable handwriting has gone a little wobbly. But your mind? Still sharp enough to make a minister weep with a single raised eyebrow. So what are you up to? You're revising. Of course you're point one last polish of your ceremonial manual. That glorious, sprawling tome on how emperors should behave, how they should dress, process, enter a room, accept guests, attend banquets, and even sit down gracefully without wrinkling their robes. A book that reads like the sacred gospel of protocol but is really a subtle manifesto for stability. A blueprint for dignity in an undignified world. Quirky detail, you included a section describing the precise angle of head tilt required when receiving ambassadors from the caliphate. Slightly down, eyes neutral, no smile. You tested it yourself in a bronze mirror, people laughed, until it worked, and they kept using it. You've also been working on your histories. They say you're biased, too soft on your grandfather, too cold on the generals. But you've earned your bias. You're not just a writer. You're in the story. You've bled ink into every line. Still, it's not vanity that drives you. It's the hope that someone, some bright-eyed boy centuries from now, will stumble upon your words and realize that this empire wasn't just a gold leaf illusion. It was made of people. Some flawed, some divine. Some foolish, some brilliant. All trying to keep the fire burning. Historians still argue whether you were a weak ruler masked by good advisors, or a genius hiding behind a curtain of books. But that's fine. You never ruled for applause. You ruled for continuity, and maybe, just maybe, you were one of the few who understood the long game. Not conquest. Not glory, survival. That's what Byzantium needed most. Not a lion. A gardener. A steward. Someone who could write a book about how to set a table, and mean every word of it, because in a place where a single wrong gesture could spark a riot, and an ill-timed banquet could doom a dynasty, manners weren't just niceties. They were survival tactics. They were acts of statecraft, and now, the pen rests, the scribes are quiet, the wax seals are cooling, and you, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, Emperor of the Romans, born in the purple, architect of appearances, are ready to rest. No fanfare. No last speech. You slip away sometime in the night, the empire mourns, of course. Candles are lit, icons kissed, psalms sung. Romanos, your son, inherits the throne. He's capable. A little rough around the edges, but he watched you closely. He knows the rules, knows the book. The empire lives on, and slowly, over the years, they'll forget your face, but they'll keep following your instructions. For centuries, your ceremonial manual will guide coronations, rituals, diplomatic receptions, even seating arrangements at imperial dinners. Your voice, in footnotes. Your rhythms, in their processions, and that, oddly enough, is your greatest trick, not immortality in statues or cathedrals, but in how someone, someday, will take a seat just so, fingers resting precisely on the table's edge, and not even know they're echoing an emperor who believed in the power of order, and manners, and the quiet kind of greatness. So now, as we leave behind the flickering oil lamps and velvet-thick shadows of Constantinople, let your thoughts settle like dust after a long parade. You've walked in the sandals of a man who ruled not by shouting, not by swinging a sword, but by thinking. By writing. By shaping silence into structure, and pageantry into peace. Let your breath slow. Picture the purple robes folded neatly on a cedar chest. The scrolls gently rolled and tied with silk ribbon. The distant sound of a lyre drifting up through a courtyard as doves settle on the eaves. History doesn't always shout, sometimes, it whispers through etiquette manuals and lingers in the curve of a ceremonial goblet. It hides in posture and pageantry. And it hums gently in the corridors of time, reminding us that not all rulers are conquerors, some are caretakers, some are gardeners. You've just met one. Now let the glow of those mosaic halls fade from your imagination, bit by bit, like the last flicker of candlelight before sleep. Let the tension in your shoulders melt away as the empire slips into shadow behind you, still standing, still waiting for morning, and whether you're nestled under blankets or sprawled out on a couch, know this: you've made it through another strange and beautiful piece of history. Sleep well, traveler.